Thank you. 3 to 4.
Good evening, everyone, and welcome to Happy Valentine's Police Advisory Committee. I'm Stephanie Rink, the chair. We are going to start with attendance, and I'm going to go with Krista.
Krista Gross, at large.
Rocky Lucas, WSU faculty.
Melissa Medali, Pioneer Hill.
Eric Tetzloff, business.
Barbara Hammond, College Hill.
Phyllis Stahlkop, Sunnyside Hill.
Carol Damuki, multicultural.
Megan Parks, GPSA.
Gary Jenkins, police chief.
And Jake Opka, North Commander.
Thank you. Moving on, we're going to do the approval of the minutes. Does anybody have any questions or comments about the minutes from last time? Hearing none, do we have a motion to approve? Do we have a second?
Second.
All those in favor? Any opposed? Great, minutes passed. So the next thing we're going to have is we have a wonderful presenter tonight, our Support Services Manager, Penny Revits. Welcome, Penny. We're so happy to have you here with us tonight.
I'm going to question the talent you've been asking to come then.
You are amazing.
You're hilarious. Well, thank you, Stephanie. You are very good for my ego. Thanks for having me. I'm always surprised when anyone wants to talk about records. Always surprised. So I'm Penny Revis. I'm the Pullman Police Department Support Services Manager. I've been with Pullman for, I want to say 32 years. I feel like I'm always gray in that it's 32, I'm almost positive. Our support services consists of reception, transcription, public records, property and evidence, and I'm the liaison for building maintenance, meaning if something needs painted or bathrooms overflowing, I'm that guy. So our reception area, just to let you know about the obvious things we do, we are 24-hour staffed. Not everyone knows that. Our officers are 24, so we are there for them as well, so we might as well be there for everyone. We like to say we're the go-to team, and we really do believe in that. So we answer phones, we receipt out money for parking tickets and pet licenses. We relay messages to the officers if you can't get a hold of them because they're out and about, they're dispatched. They can never really tell you when they're going to be available, so we help facilitate those messages. We give general directions. If people call and ask how to get to a certain place, we can help you with that. And we accept packages for City Hall sometimes, now that they've moved, but we accept all the packages that come in for regular business. Things that we do that you might not realize. I think people just connect with certain departments in the city, and once you have that go-to team, you just call them. So we get phone calls all the time about road conditions, what's the weather, and it doesn't even have to be in the wintertime. People want to know about closures everywhere. And we'll Google it for you and we'll let you know. So that's what we do. Why is my power out? Probably in my head I'm like, I don't know. But actually I know how to figure it out. So we Google that too. Avista is great. They have a really amazing website. They will tell you why your power is out, and they'll tell you how many other people in your area are also out of power. Some of the quirky ones we have had is personal check. Young people don't write checks these days, so we had a young person call because they had to send a personal check somewhere and they had no idea what that meant. I wouldn't think about calling the police department about a personal check. But I just assumed they had a good experience, and they called us and were like, let me tell you how to do that. So we took the steps. We also said, if you Google that, it'll tell you how to do that. So anyway, most recently we had a woman call from Oregon on behalf of her grandfather who was in an accident and wanted us to tell her who the insurance company was of the other driver of her grandfather of an accident that happened in Oregon. And, you know, we don't have access to every police department's records. We only have access to our own. But we Googled that. We found out which agency she needed to contact, and we got her to where she needed to go. Anyway, we get a lot of phone calls that we call them quirky. Let's see, I think the most calls that we've been getting more and more that seems very out of our realm has been attempted suicide calls. So that's been really hard on my staff. We don't hire them with that in mind. So Chief Jenkins has been really great about finding us classes that talk about, like, do no harm. How do we take a phone call like that when we're not necessarily trained? Like the dispatchers, they train in those areas. So we've also worked with the dispatch center, which has been fabulous, on how to transfer those calls, you know, in a nice transitional way so we're not putting you on hold. We have a system where we can IM them, and they can IM us back if we feel like we can't separate from that caller. So those are kind of the more serious things that do happen at our little reception area. So let me talk about transcription. It's kind of a secret love of mine that I do not ever tell anyone because it's from the 80s, and I love all things from the 80s. Transcription is an old system where our officers dictate their reports on a digital recorder, and they download it, and then our staff types it. We're faster. We cost a little less money than a police officer, and that lets the officer go back out on the road and do what he needs, process his evidence, so we can type up those reports while he's doing what he really needs to get done. I think it's a kind of a genius trade-off. You know, sometimes my staff will grumble about someone who doesn't enunciate, or they drink their pop, or they have their music up too loud. But, you know, we take care of those. But what goes with that that's not necessarily great is our receptionist or our transcriptionists. If you go to a hard call, they will hear 3 versions of that hard call. A fatal accident is an example. So we hear and see just as much as any officer does. So sometimes that can be hard on them. We never, if it's too hard on you and you tell me, I will pull you off that and someone else can pick it up. So we're never gonna put anyone in a situation where they're overly, you know, consumed by something that's hard for them to hear over and over and over again. And my staff is very good at letting me know, like, I'm not typing another one of those. So I have on here in my PowerPoint that I supervise evidence, and that changed February 1st. But I feel like I know enough about how it works to still present that to you guys. So our evidence manager accepts evidence in a very secure room. He logs all movements of that property, whether it's viewed by the prosecutor or it's transferred to the court, or if an officer needs to get in and look at it again, that's always written down and documented. When it's returned to the owner, that everything is documented. This ensures that evidence keeps that chain of custody intact. And he also makes sure that it's packaged correctly for the crime lab because they have a set of standards that are state regulated. And if an officer doesn't package that evidence correctly, he will send it back in a secure locker and give them back their key in a lockbox like you might see at a realtor house that's for sale. And I do want to mention Jake just did a huge audit. He supervised an audit because we just transferred from our old evidence property officer to a new property officer. So they audited money, drugs, and weapons. And then they did I don't know if it's a less thorough, but then they did a in general audit with all the other property in the room. It was a 2-day, took you 2 days? At least, right? So we also take found property. So found property can be a wallet, a bicycle in the creek. We get a lot of stuff turned in that doesn't really have value, but we'll take that, and after 6 months, if no one claims it, then by law, we can throw it away or donate it. So we also document all components of found property. Purse contents, bicycles, etc. We try to contact an owner. We always try to get keys back to owners, wallets, IDs. It's amazing how many IDs are just laying around the street. And we have this great thing called Found Drop. So if you look at the screen, it's kind of a play on words. It's Found Drop with 1 D. And if you put in the city of Pullman, it will take you to our found property page where you can see the set of keys that you are looking for. We're not always successful at getting keys back. I don't know how people are driving their cars because we have a lot of keys, but every once in a while. This little page will tell you how to contact us and what it is. I thought it also told you where it was found, but it doesn't look like it does. So really the meat and potatoes of my unit is records. So in the 60s, the government decided we needed laws regulating how we release police records. And then in 1972, the voters voted to adopt an initiative making most records even more available to the public. So people think that police records are held tight and private. Most records start out open and available to the public. And there are a few exceptions that would allow me or my staff to redact that or withhold certain information to protect certain parts of someone's privacy. I don't know if you have insomnia, but if you do, you should research these RCWs. They are state laws, so just like our officers have state laws that they have to follow, our records department, we also have state laws that mandate what we do with our records. So the top RCW mandates that the police department must have a contact person for public records. And we do. As a matter of fact, we have currently 4 employees who are certified public records officers, and that's a really big deal. It takes at least 2 years and money for travel and training to get someone up to that level, and Chief Jenkins has been pretty supportive of getting us all certified, because when someone takes a vacation or they need a break, we can share the wealth, so to speak, and that isn't just a burden for one person. Most disclosure laws are regulated under 4256. 1097 is the Privacy Act, and then 1350 dictates how we handle juvenile records. If you need a police record, maybe someone put graffiti on your fence or stole your garbage can or you were in an accident, maybe, I don't know, you were at the bar and you had a tussle, whatever. You can go to our website and you can request a public record from our website. It's actually a really great tool. We get public records every day, a dozen every day. And this allows us to put everything in one place. I can check to make sure everything is on target and it's meeting its requirement date to go out, or at least have someone respond to you, letting you know what we're doing with that request. Let's see. A few general rules about giving someone's information or records out is based on like your arrest information. So I mean, I can go down a rabbit's hole here about police reports and arrest reports. For an arrest report, if you were convicted, let's just say, of a DUI, if someone requested a copy of that report, I, by law, can give that out. I can share that information because that person was found guilty, so it's considered conviction. The public has a right to know about that. If you are found not guilty, we would black your name out. We could give the report out, but your name would be protected because it's non-conviction. So you do have certain rights for privacy, which is nice. That's the way it should be. I do want to alert you to the WATCH program through the State Patrol. If you have small business or you're hiring a nanny or those small things that we do in our community, you can go to this website and for $11 instantly know whether or not someone has conviction history or non-conviction. It's only for Washington, but other states have something similar. Idaho has something called Idaho Courts. If you just Googled Idaho Courts, it's going to take you to their website. And courts are different because their stuff is all public. But that's just a really good website for small businesses, I think, to do an extra layer of checking. Other services we do in support services is we issue itinerant vendor permits. That's for people who are going door to door, selling magazines or books. We have a prescription drug disposal box in the front lobby. So your prescriptions, if you don't need them anymore, or you had someone who passed away that maybe you helped clean out their house, we would take those prescription drugs. It's no cost to you. We don't take needles or sharps, but you can call a phone number and they will mail you a mailer, and you can mail those back to them at no cost. It's actually a really, really nice service. We do fingerprinting services. So if you have a concealed pistol license, we would take your fingerprints anytime, Monday through Friday, as long as we're staffed to do that during regular business hours. If you need fingerprinted for a job, like you're going to be a teacher or you're in banking, I think banking people need to be fingerprinted every 2 years. If you're going overseas in some circumstances, or you're adopting, so we also provide those services. We do ask that you make appointments for those type of things. And we sell residential parking permits, and parking is a pretty hot topic, I think, always. So if your neighborhood has permits, come see us and we'll see if we can't find a permit to sell you. They're $5 and $10. They're super reasonable. And you get to park on the street. So that's just a very small presentation. I'm pretty sure we don't want to go any longer. But if you have any questions, I'd be happy to answer them. Yes?
I think I saw on Facebook that the police department's giving away masks and COVID testing kits. Is that?
That is correct,
Okay,
yes.
that's where we just go to the front desk
Yep, just
there?
come to the front desk.
Thank
Yes,
you.
you're welcome.
Are there any other questions? Well, Penny, as always, you did a fabulous job.
You're so silly. Love you so much. I hope you guys have a great meeting. I'm sorry he's making you meet on Valentine's Day. Or maybe that's Stephanie.
Maybe.
Maybe. Okay, that makes sense. Hey, well, I'm going to go.
Thank you, Penny. All right, wonderful. So Chief Jenkins, you are up with our IA report.
Give me just a second. I need to swap a couple things around here. Carol, was it you who brought in the treats? Well, thank you very much for bringing those in. Let's take a quick 1-minute break, and whoever wants to come up and grab something. So the seating kind of reminds me of when I go to police officer trainings. You have to get there early so you can sit way in the back because it fills up from the back forward. And it's all making sense now. So I'm going to provide just a really quick summary of each IA, or Internal Affairs Investigation, that we did last year in 2021. Before we do that, what I have up on the screen right now is an excerpt from our policy manual that describes the different dispositions that we can have or assign to an IA once it's completed. So exonerated means that the conduct alleged did occur, but that it was lawful and proper. Next one is unfounded, meaning that what was alleged did not occur. Next one is not sustained, meaning that we could not determine to any kind of degree of certainty to prove or disprove the allegations. And then sustained is that the allegation is supported by the evidence. So I ran a report in our system that we use to document IAs, which is really somewhat of an antiquated system. In fact, we just installed a new system that we purchased that includes IAs as well as many other administrative tasks. We're in the process of getting that up and running and transferring all the information over. But this is just a report I ran on our current system for all of the IAs from last year, and I went through and just redacted the names of the parties that made the allegations and also the officers' names. So the very first one there was essentially a complaint about racial discrimination, and was received by way of a letter from the Attorney General's office, who received the complaint from someone wishing to allege that certain law enforcement agencies were engaged in racial discrimination against her specifically. And the agencies listed were Washington State Patrol, WSU Police Department, Pullman Police Department, and maybe Whitman County Sheriffs. So we ran and the allegations revolved around her receiving citations. So we ran the person's name in our system and found no evidence of any contact with this person. So that's actually a good example of an unfounded case where there was an allegation and there's no evidence to support that at all. The second one, so, and you'll see how they're numbered. So in the very far left yellow row, you'll see 2101, so that's the first IA in 2021. So 2102. This was a complaint where one of our code enforcement officers was downtown issuing tickets, and this was very early on in the pandemic. And there was a mask requirement with some exceptions, and one exception is if you're out working outside by yourself. So what this particular code enforcement officer would do would be when they were walking around issuing tickets, if they weren't around anyone, they would have their mask off. But if they approached someone or someone approached them, they would put their mask back on to comply with the requirement. So in this situation, the code enforcement officer issued a ticket and there was no one around, and as the code enforcement officer was walking away, the person who was in charge of that vehicle came up and approached the code enforcement officer really without him knowing to the last second, and he turned to see what was going on, and there was an exchange about the legitimacy of the ticket and that type of thing. Anyway, they ended up parting, and then that person followed the code enforcement officer and wanted to continue in a conversation, so the code enforcement officer put their mask on. And anyway, the person ended up still with the ticket. The code enforcement officer didn't remove it, and so this person filed a complaint. And even though the code enforcement officer was potentially in a technical violation of not wearing a mask when the person first approached them, we didn't feel that the officer had an opportunity really to put their mask on and become compliant. And there was also, based on information received from the person complaining, it appeared to be somewhat retaliatory in nature because they received the citation. So in this case, this was an exoneration, meaning that, yes, the code enforcement officer didn't have their mask on during part of that conversation, but that the code enforcement officer really didn't have a reasonable opportunity to comply. So that was an exoneration. 2103. And so we also list the potential violations with all of these, and the potential violation on that one was a policy that had to do with compliance with orders. So we had when the proclamations were issued, essentially we provided those as directives to our staff to comply with those proclamations. (2103) was a situation where a business owner called to complain about an intoxicated person in front of their business harassing some of their customers. So an officer responded, went inside to talk to the business owner to find out the specific complaint, and then that officer went outside and worked with other officers to address the issue. The business owner later complained that they didn't like the way the officer handled the call because they went inside and told the band to stop playing and disrupted their business. And so part of that investigation, we watched the body-worn camera video, and it was apparent by watching the video that when the officer went in to talk to the business owner, it was either the band wasn't playing at the time or they stopped on their own when the officer walked in to get more information. So on that one, essentially we found that unfounded because the allegation of disrupting the business by making the band stop did not occur. Uh, 2104, this was a person that was in a medical center or was a customer coming to a medical office, and they had been previously trespassed from that office, and they started creating a disturbance by raising their voice and yelling at employees. And so officers responded and to address the situation, and spent a fair amount of time talking with this person and finding out that the person had been trespassed. They also called for a supervisor to come to the scene because the person was making allegations that the officers were not handling the call properly and claiming that they were being discriminated against because of their disability. I believe they were in a wheelchair. So they felt, and then a report was written later, and the person obtained a copy of the report through the process that Penny just described. And this person felt that there were false allegations made against her and that the police painted a negative picture of the person. And they characterized the person as threatening, and that none of that information was true. And so during the investigation, the body-worn camera videos were observed, and then we got the audio from the Whitcomb 911 center, where you could hear a lot of the disturbance that was being created by this person that was actually threatening employees. So the bottom line was the investigation determined that everything in the report was characterized the situation accurately, and that there was no discrimination because of the person's disability. In fact, officers made a number of attempts to assist the person to where she should be going, which she refused. So the potential allegations on that were contact with the public about our expectations for demeanor when contacting the public, and then also the accurate completion of police reports. Oh. So that was the 2104 at the top. The next one, 2105. So this was a situation where an officer contacted a person doing some lawn maintenance or some landscape maintenance, and a lot of debris was being blown into the street. And so the officer contacted that person regarding that and asked them to not put debris in the street, which would be against city code. And then I believe later, it sounded like that interaction was not received well, and that officer later apparently talked to the person's superior just to let them know also that that's what they've asked their employees to do. So that person made a complaint feeling that the officer was harassing him and should not have been telling them to not do what he was doing. and also that he went to his boss and caused him an issue with that. So again, we went to body-worn camera video and found that the officer acted appropriately and was enforcing city code as he was supposed to, and so that one was found unfounded. (2106). This was a complaint about an officer while he was off duty. So our policy manual does cover certain conduct of employees while they're off duty because of the expectation and of them as police officers. And so it's something that's kind of, I guess, not in all professions where the employer can regulate conduct of their employees while they're off duty, but law enforcement is one of those. And so in this particular case, this officer was accompanying a tribal police officer who was doing a welfare check at a tribe who were in the care and custody of a tribe, and they were following up. This officer was following up, the Nez Perce tribal officer was following up on the case, and this officer was just with them. And we ended up receiving a complaint saying that this officer was exceeding his authority as a Pullman police officer and introduced himself as a police officer and attempted to use that authority to exert some kind of decision-making on the tribe. And so after an investigation and talking to people that were there, and the result was that this officer never did identify himself as a police officer, and I don't believe he ever even spoke at the location. Is that right, Jake? So we found that the officer was there, but that did not engage in any misconduct, and so he was exonerated on that. And the policy on that is under contemporary community standards. I'll go ahead and all right, 2107. So this was a situation where an officer stopped a person and for a traffic violation and ended up warning the person, but this person had been stopped by Pullman police before, and I think also had a previous contact with the same officer. Is that right, Jake? And the traffic stop was for an unsafe lane change. Is that right? In front of the officer. So the complaint was that the officer only stopped this person because of their race, and that the officer was harassing him. So the investigation found that we had not only body-worn camera but also in-car camera video. So we found that the officer did not even know who this person was or could tell their race before they stopped him. But we did find that the officer did not safely operate his vehicle during that traffic stop. So we did find that that two of the allegations, contact with the public and discrimination, were unfounded, but operating the vehicle was sustained. And actually, the unsafe operation was based on how the lining on the streets should have been painted, but in that particular area, it was worn enough that it was very difficult to see. Am I describing this right, Jake?
Well, it's a piece of the road where it goes from one lane and it divides into two lanes going in the same direction. But the road
So again, technically, we did find that the officer was in violation of one of those allegations, but because of the way that the road markings were, that it was essentially just the officer was given a warning, there was no disciplinary action. $2108. So this was a situation where officers were called to some, what was the original call on that? Just some a disturbance?
Officers saw a car speeding at really high rate of speed, turned on it, and finally found the car stopped in this parking lot with the occupants of the car already outside of the car. So it was self-initiated. He was trying to investigate the traffic offense, but he was talking to the three people trying to determine who was the driver.
And then, so there was the parties that were involved in this were very agitated and very vocal and argumentative with the officers. The officers were trying to figure out what was going on and trying to talk to the parties. And so a complaint was made that the officers did not provide their names when they were asked, and that they did not talk with one of the persons only because he was Hispanic. And just that the officers were not treating them fairly and professionally. And so we had body-worn camera from all of the officers on scene and found that they were actually engaging the subject who was Hispanic, probably more so than the other people at the scene. The officers did provide their names when they were asked, and that the officers handled the call appropriately. So those are all unfounded. $2109 was actually, it was going to be issued an IA, and it turned into what we call a field conciliation. So what that means is if a supervisor sees an officer doing something and needs to correct them, it doesn't always turn into an internal affairs investigation. It doesn't necessarily mean that there's, it rises to that level and a supervisor can just handle it. And so that's what was done in this particular case. A supervisor had seen something and then handled it directly with the employee and did not require an IA. And then the last one, 2110. This was a situation where an officer chose to take a police report from someone, mainly because of their personal relationship with that person. And we found that the investigation itself was proper. Everything that was done in the investigation would have been done the same way by anyone else, whether they had a personal interest or not. But just the fact that this officer chose to be involved in this investigation when they should have excluded themselves from it. We did look at this. We didn't have a specific policy that directly covered that. And so what the disposition of this was is that that officer was in a specialty collateral position, and so we removed the officer from that collateral position as a result of this. So that's kind of a taste of what IAs looked like last year. We have some years where there are some more serious allegations, and some years where we might have a few more that are sustained. But this is just a sample of what we had last year. So does anybody have any questions? Megan? Yes. So when the complaint's done, we notify the person that made the complaint what the disposition is. And then also, the whole process, the officer is kept informed, and they're given the disposition as well, and then it's documented.
Any other questions for Chief?
Well, for this one, this makes sense where a camera is not available. That one makes sense. But refresh my memory, like the page before this one. When are cameras in use and when do we have them available and when do we not have cameras and video available?
So we do have a policy that covers specific situations where officers are supposed to activate their cameras, but generally speaking, it's when they're involved in some type of enforcement action or some type of adversarial interaction is when they're required. And we find that the cameras are activated in more instances than are required by policy. So there's very few situations that we look at as far as an IA goes where there's not body-worn camera video. Now, like on the last one, the body-worn camera video was kind of irrelevant because it wasn't really had to do with the officer's conduct. It was just that he did something or not, whether he did something or not.
One question I had is, when it comes to like informing the person who made the complaint, is it just like just like a couple words that say, hey, we found it was unfounded, for example, or is it a more detailed report you give them, like we watched the video, the cams, and this is what we saw, or something, or?
Yeah. It really depends. Some of the IAs are a little bit more complex than others, but generally, if we find that there's the officer's exonerated or it's unfounded, we will let the complainant know why we came to that conclusion. Or if we find that it was sustained, we will tell them that it was sustained and that we would be taking personnel action to address the situation without describing the specifics of the action, which can range from what's called supervisory counseling all the way up to termination. Some of the disciplines that are more serious involve days off without pay, and then goes down to like a written reprimand or just a verbal counseling. And then we use what's called progressive discipline, which means if someone commits the same or similar type of an infraction, the second and subsequent times, the disciplinary action increases in severity. And that doesn't mean we can't start at a severe amount of discipline for the first time, but it would be commensurate with the level of the violation as well.
Thank you, Chief.
You're welcome.
We'll just continue with you for the update,
The
department
Chief's
update.
All right, well, I've got to go get those notes. Hold on. I almost revealed all my top secret stuff on my computer.
Just make sure all your passwords are listed up there. And everything.
Yeah, I usually start typing my password on some kind of document that is not the thing asking for the password. So.
Well, while we wait, Carol, your treats were very delicious. Thank you for bringing those.
So with the police officer vacancies, we now only have 2 vacancies because we hired Eli Romanoff and Darren Romero, and they started the academy. Well, they started with us January 16th and 17th, and they are in the academy now through June 8th. So that leaves 2 vacancies. We do have 1 candidate in background right now that I think the person had their last test today that they needed to do, and more than likely I'll be making a job offer this week. The next available academy is in Burien in May. And we have interviews now scheduled for the next round of police officer applicants in March. We have 1 records vacancy. We've been interviewing the top 3 candidates for the most recent recruitment, and we started a background on 1 of those applicants today. I believe I described last time the new administrative sergeant position, and we were having some sergeants move around because of that. And so moving into that new administrative sergeant position is Greg Umbright, who had been in detectives. So replacing him in detectives is Sergeant Aaron Brashears. And then replacing Sergeant Brashears in patrol is Alex Gordon, who was recently promoted to sergeant. So we had a little bit of musical chairs for sergeants. Our police commander recruitment is in progress. And we're going to be holding an assessment center for applicants on March 11th. We're still accepting applications through February 20th. So we don't know how many applicants we'll have going through that assessment center. And the assessment center will include 2 interview panels, a law enforcement panel and a community panel, and then 2 different scenarios during the assessment center, a presentation, and then also a portfolio assessment. The Citizen Academy, we are in the 3rd week this week. That runs through April 14th. We have 28 in the current class, right? Is that right, Stephanie? 28? Yes. So we're meeting in here, and we have tables set up in the council chambers behind me for that, and it's a full room. I mentioned before that we received a law enforcement mental health and wellness grant that actually Megan helped us write, and she's going to be researching. We selected an advisor who's a mental health professional, and we are moving forward. Did we determine that our officers had already received the training, or they're going to be going to some training?
All of them except 1 has received the minimum training.
So we're moving forward with that, and that's with our partners at WSU Police Department and Moscow Police Department. The legislative session, I think, has maybe a couple more weeks to go. And so we're monitoring some of the law enforcement legislation that's going through. And it looks like we will get some legislation that will amend some of the legislation that was passed last year in the areas of, for example, what's considered a military weapon. They're going to redefine that so that more than likely we'll get our less lethal 40 millimeter back. And then potentially in the area of use of force with regard to being able to detain someone suspected of committing a crime. So we are watching those closely. Our College Hill officer opened a couple of social media accounts. He opened a Twitter account and an Instagram account, and it's not under the officer's name, it's under a College Hill officer, so that those social media accounts can be passed along to subsequent College Hill officers and stay active. And I didn't see how many users he has so far, but it looks like it's taken off and he has a lot of followers. And that's a lot of how he communicates with students and student organizations. And so I've gotten some really good feedback from some of the fraternities and sororities about that. Our property and evidence technician, Rick Perringer, who previously was a police officer, retired after 44 years with the police department. Josh Sanders, who had been a record specialist, was selected to take Rick's position in property and evidence. And so they were able to overlap, and Rick was able to train Josh for over a month. I think it was a couple of months. And then Josh is scheduled to attend some training on property and evidence. So that's a really sometimes forgotten but critical area in the police department where we place a lot of responsibility. And Josh will do a really good job in that position. And then as Penny was talking about, the audit that we did was to facilitate that changeover and to make sure that we pass everything along with appropriate documentation. And Chris already asked this question, it was answered about the Can-90 masks and the home rapid tests. We are a distribution point for Whitman County Department of Public Health, and they are keeping a stock, so we haven't had a problem keeping those available for employees and the public. And I think that's all I have.
So I did look it up. The College Hill Instagram is 412 followers and Twitter is 41. So they need some love on Twitter.
Yeah, really. Well, is like Twitter and Facebook kind of the now the old people's social media?
Maybe. Maybe he needs to start a TikTok.
Yeah.
Okay, any questions for Chief?
Yeah, I have a quick question. I was just wondering, for each of the officers that you hire, about how many applicants do you have for each of those positions to choose from?
It really varies with time, but I would say what we see now, so it changes when we have a continuous recruitment versus not having a continuous recruitment. So we're having a continuous recruitment right now, which means we're taking applications all the time, and then we're having interviews at regular intervals. We've gone a year or two sometimes without having a recruitment. And so when that happens, we have a lot more applicants. So I would say when we're in that position, we'll usually see 30 or 40 applicants, and then our civil service examiner will screen them down to 12 to 18 or so to interview. In our current situation where we're having interviews every 2 or 3 months, I think we have about 15 or so that we narrow down to try to do at least 1 day's worth, or a maximum of 1 day's worth.
Any other questions? Thank you, Chief.
You're welcome.
Does anybody have any updates in the areas they represent? Hop in town. Seeing that we have no public tonight, so we won't have any public comments, our next meeting is March 14th. If you want any more treats, there with Carol. There's also some chocolate in the back. Otherwise, have a lovely evening.